Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Stefan Zweig's memoir, The World of Yesterday, Memoirs of a European, translated from the German by Anthea Bell and published by Pushkin Press. Stefan Zweig was a Jewish-Austrian author, or let's just say European author. I'm not sure if he'd want to be identified with his nationality. I'll come back to that later. Zweig was writing in the first half of the 20th century, and for a time he was one of the most famous authors in the world. I mean, for a time, he was the most translated author in the world. This book, however, his memoir, was written while he was living in exile in London, and then New York, and then Brazil, throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. See, Zweig fled Austria and eventually fled all of Europe during Hitler's rise to power. He fled without any of his possessions. And he wrote this memoir that is really about recollecting a Europe that, in his mind, in the 1930s and early 40s, was disappearing. And this book brilliantly encapsulates this world of early 20th century Vienna that really no longer exists. Indeed, the disappearance of this world was so heartbreaking to Zweig that the day after he mailed the manuscript of his memoir to his publisher, him and his wife committed suicide in 1942. What this book is really about is perhaps just the greatest question of the 20th century. How did Europe go from the soaring heights of culture and art and the booming economy of the turn of the century to two world wars that left tens of millions of people dead? How did we go from what Zweig describes as the, quote, golden age of security to a world defined by genocide and the stripping away of civil liberties? How did we go from people going out each night to the theater to listen to performances of Beethoven and Mozart and Bach and Schubert and Schumann and Brahms to people spending their nights in trenches or in bombing shelters? How did we go in just a generation or two from the liberal democracies that, have all sorts of problems, to be fair, but argue that personal freedom and personal liberty is paramount, if not sacred, to far right-wing xenophobic fascism? These are good questions, and ones that I think we still need to consider, as I don't think anyone has fully figured out, and Zweig certainly doesn't provide a single answer for. But what he does do is explore this movement in such an intimate way that you also can't help but mourn the losses of this world of yesterday. Zweig was born in Vienna and spent most of his childhood there. And Vienna was in many ways the center of European culture around this time, at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century. And Zweig remembers these years fondly, and he thinks that he has a duty to write this memoir so that these years will be remembered. And he just has this absolutely brilliant opening, in which he writes, "I never considered myself important enough to feel tempted to tell others the story of my life. Much had to happen, far more in the shape of terrible events, disasters, and trials than any other single generation has known, before I found the courage to embark on a book in which I feature as the main, or more accurately, the central character. Nothing is further from my mind than to bring myself to the fore, unless in the sense of being the presenter of a lecture illustrated by slides. The Times provide the pictures, I merely speak the words to go with them, and it will not be so much my own stories I tell, as that of an entire generation, our unique generation, carrying a heavier burden of fate than almost any other in the course of history." And so he takes as his subject, right, the individual, but what he's really talking about is the history that expands past the national, right? The history of Europe at this time. And he ends this foreword to his memoir with this just awesome meditation on memory. He writes, "But our generation has learnt the fine art of not mourning for what is lost, and perhaps the loss of documentation and detail will even be an advantage in this book of mine. For I regard memory not as a phenomenon preserving one thing and losing another merely by chance, but as a power that deliberately places events in order or wisely omits them. Everything we forget about our own lives was really condemned to oblivion by an inner instinct long ago. Only what I want to preserve for myself has any claim to be preserved for others. So I ask my memories to speak and choose for me, and give at least some faint reflection of my life before it sinks into the dark. And it's important to remember that while he's writing this memoir, he's living in exile and he has none of his belongings, none of his diaries or journals or any of his books. Like the world that he's describing, his childhood, his early life has also disappeared. But even without any of his sources, the descriptions of his childhood and his adolescence and early adulthood are just absolutely engrossing. He describes his time in grammar school, which he didn't particularly like because he found it too totalitarian and abusive, but he loved the intellectual milieu that he found himself in. He is absorbed in an intellectual environment in which he just hangs out with all of these young men, and all they do is talk about poetry and write poetry and discuss art. It's interesting because Zweig doesn't really know how or why him and all of his friends got into art and got into poetry, but they did, and they all became just super enthralled with it. You know, they go to the theater every single night and they listen to classical music and they study languages and they read books and all this different stuff. And this part of this book actually reminded me quite a bit about the various biographies of JRR Tolkien. I read, I think, most biographies of JRR Tolkien at this point, and of the Inklings, right, the group that Tolkien was a part of, because Tolkien also grew up in the early 20th century, right, the late 19th, early 20th century, and his childhood was also interrupted by World War I. But he also remembers fondly this just hyper-intellectual environment that he found himself in. And the contrast between the youth of Zweig and Tolkien and their early adulthood is, well, brutal to even think about. So Zweig is caught up in his childhood, in the exuberance, to the point where he, as a young man, kind of loses track of the real world. He writes, "We young men, however, wholly absorbed in our literary ambition, noticed little of these dangerous changes in our native land. Our eyes were bent entirely on books and pictures. We took not the slightest interest in political and social problems. What did all this shrill squabbling mean in our lives? The city was in a state of agitation at election time. We went to the libraries. The masses rose up. We wrote and discussed poetry. We failed to see the writing on the wall in the letter of fire. Like King Belshazzar, before us, we dined on the delicious dishes of the arts and never looked apprehensively ahead. Only decades later, when the roof and walls of the building fell in on us, did we realize that the foundations had been undermined long before, and the downfall of individual freedom in Europe had begun with the new century." This idea that the intellectual elite is as being sort of aloof to the real problems in the world is something that really hasn't changed too much, to be fair. But this memoir goes on until we're in, the middle of the second decade of the 20th century, and, well, the Great War breaks out. And throughout the sections where the two world wars rage on in the background, there's just this anger and disgust and sorrow and confusion as Zweig is trying to come to terms with this shift from beauty, art, and creation to hatred, death, and destruction. And he tries to make sense of it, especially World War I, which fundamentally interrupted his idyllic life. He writes, "If today, thinking it over calmly, we wonder why Europe went to war in 1914, there is not one sensible reason to be found, nor even any real occasion for the war. There were no ideas involved, and it was not really about drawing minor borderlines. I can explain it only thinking of that excess of power, by seeing it as a tragic consequence of the internal dynamicism that had built up during those 40 years of peace and now demanded release. Every state suddenly felt it was strong and forgot that other states felt exactly the same. All states wanted even more and wanted some of what the others already had. The worst of it was that the very thing we loved most, our common optimism, betrayed us. For everyone thought that everyone else would back down at the last minute, and so the diplomats began their game of mutual bluff." And there is this real distrust of nationalism in this memoir. He blames this in-group, out-group mentality and for a lot of the problems that face the world. It actually reminds me a lot of the writings of, I only have one of his books here, of Benedict Anderson in the later 20th century. Who also writes about the problems of nationalism and the ideologies that are created through fervent nationalism. And Zweig goes even further, and he blames the rise of Hitler and the breakout of World War II on the, quote, terrible hysteria of hatred, which he links directly to fervent nationalism. Nationalism, in his mind, always leads us to an us versus them mentality. And, well, again, who creates these groups? Zweig is nationally an Austrian, but he's also a Jew. So is he actually Austrian? Who draws these lines? And as the subtitle to this book suggests, Memoirs of a European, what Zweig really believes in is the idea of Europe as an entity. Not Austria, not Germany, not France, but a united Europe. There's all these passages where he travels throughout Europe to all the different countries and talks about how his books are being translated into these languages. For Zweig, it's nationalism which disrupts this unity, which fractures the connections between all of these languages and these cultures and these people. And as an American living in the 21st century, I couldn't agree more, though I would certainly expand past just uniting Europe, of course. And I think we can actually critique, looking back on this, critique Zweig a little bit in its idealization of Europe as an entity, because at some level that will also just become a kind of nationalism. And we know all about the colonialism and imperialism and all that. That was in some ways founded on the idea of European supremacy. But in the early 20th century, I don't think we can blame him too much for not seeing past just uniting Europe. So this book is concerned with the destruction of the world of yesterday, but there's also so much in here that ruminates on art. Zweig was, again, perhaps the most famous artist in Europe in his day, and so the social circles that he interacts with and that he moves through are filled with just some of the greatest artists of the 20th century. In this book, he recounts conversations he's had with Rilke, with Freud, Gorky, and Joyce, etc. And these moments are just fantastic. If you're interested in especially early 20th century literature, I think you'll just love these parts. For Zweig, art is really the only thing that perseveres from the world of yesterday. Everything else is destroyed. Late in the memoir, after he's been living in exile for a couple of years, he returns to Vienna, his hometown, to visit just one last time, right before the outbreak of World War II. Right, he senses that things are about to go very awry, and so he wants to visit home just one last time. And this passage is just astonishingly beautiful. However, it is not a retrospective flourish, but the plain truth when I say that on those last 2 days in Vienna, I looked at every one of the familiar streets, every church, every park and garden, every old nook and cranny of the city where I had been born with a desperate, silent farewell in my mind. Never again. I embraced my mother with the same secret knowledge that it was for the last time. I turned that farewell glance on everything I saw in the city, in the country, knowing that it was goodbye forever. I passed Salzburg, where the house in which I had worked for 20 years stood, without even getting out of the train. I could have seen my house on the hill, with all of its memories of past years from the carriage windows, but I didn't look. What was the point? I would never live there again. And as the train crossed the border, I knew, like the patriarch Lot in the Bible, that all behind me was dust and ashes, the past transformed into a pillar of bitter salt. And we all know what happens next. Zweig lived in exile for a couple of years while he finished this book, and then he kills himself in 1942, just after finishing this book. Zweig didn't even know the full extent of the Holocaust when he killed himself. The full details of the Holocaust weren't fully known in 1942. He never knew about the millions of victims of the final solution. He never knew about the fire bombings of Dresden and other cities. He never knew about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Zweig's anger and disgust and frustration and sorrow at this lost world is only deepened by the fact that he didn't even know half of the level of depravity that the world would go to. The works of W.G. Sebald and Daša Drndić and Jens Bjørneboe, as well as plenty of others, all seem to work as a terrible and horrendous postscript to Zweig's memoir. So this is a pretty somber way to end this review, but I think it's an important point to end on. This book is astonishing in its scope and erudition. I haven't read any of Zweig's fiction, really, but this memoir just shows a man who really understood, as best he could, the world that he was living in, while also being just deeply concerned and confused with the direction that it was going. And it shows a man who held art above all else, as it's really the only thing that continues through these tragedies. And I think that's just beautiful. So let me know what you think. Has anyone read any of Zweig's fiction? And is it worth checking out? I'm really interested to know, as this memoir is just, well, one of the best memoirs I've ever read. But for now, thanks for watching.